with WOSU to help broaden our audience and bring in some more interesting guests. The spirit of dialogue is just as the name suggests. This is not just us talking to you, rather we hope to stimulate a conversation. So we pick a timely, topical, and sometimes contentious topic that is in the news and of import, and we share with you a little bit of expertise, but ultimately what we're going to try and do is get you to join in the conversation. All that we ask is that you be civil and respectful. This is not debate. This is not shout at each other. This is an opportunity to have an informed conversation. And so you're going to see that conversation start up here on the stage, but fairly quickly we're going to be reaching out to you. We're also beaming on Facebook Live, and so occasionally we get a question from the interwebs, the ether. But by all means, as you're listening to the conversation begin, get those questions ready. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-host here, Mike Thompson, who's going to introduce our guests and get us started.
Hello, welcome. My name is Mike Thompson. I'm the News Content Director at WOSU. Thank you all for coming. This is a terrific partnership between us and the Glenn College. We're really thrilled to be a part of this because dialogue is what we do every day. It's who we are at WOSU. Civil, but in impassioned, thoughtful discussion we do every day on 89.7 NPR News and on WOSU TV and even online where things can get a little less civil, but we get through. Anyway, 9/11, we do these events on a Tuesday. We try to do them on a Tuesday. So we looked at the calendar, and Tuesday was September 11th, and that's how we came to this topic, and we'll get to that. But 9/11, it seems like a lifetime ago, and for many people on this campus, it was a lifetime ago. Literally, they were either not born or very little. I remember I was working nights at the time. I was at home watching it all unfold on television with my 3-year-old twins running around. Thought they were completely oblivious. Then my son hands me a picture he's drawn of 2 towers with smoke coming out of it. I said, okay, let's turn the TV off now. But it just shows you, even at that early age, what an impact it had on him. He's now a student here at OSU. He's 20 years old. But it was a defining moment in many of our lives and in our country's life, in its history. It's changed the way we live. It's changed how we travel. It's changed how we gather in large groups. We have to have certain size bags or clear bags for certain events. It really has changed our lives, and it's changed our country's foreign policy. The war on terror continues with really no end in sight, and that's what we'll discuss here today. So here's how this works. It is a dialogue. Ann and Peter will start us off. They will talk for 10, 15 minutes or so. Then they're going to open it up for you all. You are a part of the panel. So if you have a question or a comment, we ask you to go to one of the 2 microphones on the aisle. You can, sit next to the aisle or line up behind it. Just stand there and we'll call on you. Facebook audience can chime in, write your questions to the Facebook feed, and we'll get those questions answered as well. We just ask you, as Peter said, as Trevor said, to be civil and brief. Be brief with your comments and questions. It's not a monologue. It's a dialogue. So that's our only rule for the evening. So let me introduce the guest, Peter Mansoor. You're probably all very familiar with him. History professor here at Ohio State. Before that, 26 years in the Army. Most notably, he was the executive officer to General David Petraeus during the Iraq War's surge in 2007, 2008. He's an author. He's been on CNN. He's here today. And Ann Fisher, celebrating her 9th year on the air at WOSU. It's hard to believe, 9 years she's been on All Sides with Ann Fisher, first on 820 AM, and now on 89.7 FM. And you can hear her weekdays from 10 to noon on 89.7 NPR News. So with that, Ann, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I guess, given the day, I wanted to ask you, where were you 17 years ago today?
So I was the G3, the operations officer of the 4th Infantry Division in Fort Hood, Texas, and we had just finished a morning physical training run. And I went into my office before I went home to take a shower, and my sergeant major came in and said, "Sir, turn on the TV." And turned on the TV just in time to see the second plane hit the World Trade Center. And I called up my division commander, Major General Ben Griffin, and I said, "Sir, turn on your TV, we're at war." And it just began what for me was a number of years fighting America's wars in the Middle East.
You know, I was in the newsroom at the Columbus Dispatch, and I was an editor, and I wondered where everyone went because they weren't like huddled around me. And I said, they were over huddled around the TV set, and I said, why'd they put TV sets in the newsroom? That's all that's going to happen around here. And I toddled over there, and I got there just in time to see the second plane hit the towers. And my first thought was, they're doing this on purpose. I'll never forget that feeling of on purpose, and it must have been something.
Call it neoconservatism now. That military force was very useful in that we could take dictators, implant democracy in the heart of the Middle East, use the military as a force for good, and there was a true belief that we could do this. I think a lot of those people have looked back on their decisions and might make different decisions, but some of them say, well, it was the right decision to go into Iraq, we just handled it poorly, we executed it wrong. Had we had better planning for the aftermath, it still would have worked out and it would have been a success. And I'm not so sure. I think that we would have been better off to focus on the war that we had to fight in Afghanistan and leave it at that.
And now we're in Syria. And in May, the United States announced that it was launching operations to liberate the final strongholds of the Islamic State, ISIS, in Syria in what seemed to signal a mission accomplished sort of a moment in this fight against global terrorism, I guess. But last week, the State Department announced, or earlier this week, the State Department announced a new point person on the war. And they had expanded the goals to include removing Iranian-led forces from Syria. And that sounds a whole lot like a whack-a-mole situation that we're getting into over there.
Well, it certainly has put us there for the long haul. Syria, there's two different things at play here. The rise of ISIS is a direct outgrowth of the Iraq War. ISIS is nothing more than al-Qaeda in Iraq that we had defeated during the surge that was forced across the border into Syria, where it regenerated and then used the chaos of the Syrian civil war to regrow its troop strength and get new armaments and so forth, and eventually launched an invasion back into Iraq. That force has taken it on the chin and is, as you said, on its last legs, although it still has some strongholds there in the Euphrates River corridor. The other thing that is at play there is the outgrowth of the Arab Spring. Where a lot of Arab governments were under siege from their citizens who wanted less corruption, better economic futures for them and their families. They wanted more transparent government, perhaps democracy. It wasn't clear what all their goals were, but that swept across the Arab world in 2011, and there was an immediate pushback against it. You had a coup in Egypt in 2013. You had a Libyan civil war, Saudi Arabian forces invading Bahrain, and in Syria, it erupted into civil wars. Bashar al-Assad fought back. He wasn't going to go peacefully. Eventually, Russia and Iran got involved as his patrons, and we were looking for a way to fight ISIS without putting U.S. boots on the ground, at least too many of them. And we came upon the Syrian Kurds, the YPG, the People's Protection Units, which became our proxies in the fight against ISIS. They were wonderful proxies, but they're also anathema to Bashar al-Assad and to Turkey because their goal is to create a Kurdish state there in northeastern Syria. If we were to leave now, we would basically be abandoning them to their fate, and that's not necessarily a way to treat an American ally that has done so much to fight a war that we wanted to fight against ISIS. Initially, earlier this year, President Trump said that he would leave, that we're not long for this war. He has recently backtracked on that decision, and in fact, it looks like we're going to be there now much longer, perhaps for the indefinite future.
Yeah, all right. So, when we refer to the never-ending war, it's a catchy phrase, but it's pretty Orwellian. And, all the time I grew up, I was born 8 years after World War II ended. I grew up with the Cold War. That felt like the never-ending war. I still remember the day, the wall came down in Berlin. The day you wake up and you hear that and you see that, and I don't see what wall comes down. I don't even know who necessarily, and I say me, kind of more as an ordinary person, I don't really know who we're fighting.
Well, I think what we saw with the withdrawal from Iraq in 2011 is that getting out does not necessarily solve anything. We got out, we thought we would wash our hands, let the Iraqis handle it, and then of course ISIS arose and we had to go back in. So sometimes staying is preferable, even though it costs blood and treasure to do so. But the cost in blood, although a significant tragedy for the families involved of those who are killed, it's a pretty small number now. And if the national security goals are worth it, then it's a number that the United States can afford. And in terms of treasure, you're talking $42 billion or so in Afghanistan every year. It's a big number. It would be better used here at home. But again, if you get out, do you want to see that land once again become a safe haven for Al-Qaeda? Would it? If we got out of Syria, what would happen in terms of ISIS, the Kurds? Would there be even more bloodshed there, more waves of refugees heading to Europe, destabilizing our NATO allies? So it is a very messy problem, and one that has no, there's no signing on the deck of the Missouri to end it. There's no wall coming down to end it. It's more of a continuity of warfare that's going to be with us for some time to come.
It's the longest war, if you want to call it one war against terrorism. It's also the first time we've had people going back again and again and again. The way we use our armed forces, our personnel in the military is very different, it seems.
I read there's a military humor site called Duffel Blog, and it had
Who knew?
It's like The Onion, but it had one of these articles, and the title was "Son Happy to Take Over His Father's Patrol Route in Afghanistan."
Yeah, you have to laugh or you'd cry.
Oh, I know. It's true. It's tough on the volunteer military to go back tour after tour after tour, but the commitments now are down to a level 2,000 to 3,000 in Syria and maybe 15,000 in Afghanistan, that it's sustainable. Where the cracks started to show is when we had 160,000 in Iraq and upwards of 100,000 in Afghanistan, and you were literally coming home for a year and then going back for 15 months. And that was very, very hard on the volunteer military. I'm not sure we would have been able to sustain that for the long haul. We would have had to look at other options. I know there's no political stomach for a reintroduction of the draft, but there have been calls to do that in order to spread the sacrifice more equally out on the American people.
When you teach about this war now, we're almost hitting that 20-year mark where it warrants more than a few minutes in a history class. What do you compare it to at this point?
Well, fortunately, I teach a first-year seminar. I have 16 students this fall, and it's the wars of 9/11. So we get the whole semester to focus on 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Arab Spring, and so forth. So we focus on why we're there. We focus on the planning for 9/11, what Al-Qaeda was all about, what the options were after 9/11. Today's class was on the war in Afghanistan from 2001 to the day. We spent the entire class period talking about why we got in there, how the course of the war went, and is it possible to get out? What are the options going forward? And then for the next few class periods, we'll look at the Iraq War. And so it's really a joy to be doing this with freshmen who were 1 year old when 9/11 happened. I've done it now 4 times. And it was really interesting because every time I said, okay, who here is from, where are you from? And like a quarter of the class would be from New York. And I'm like, wow, you know, Ohio State brings in a lot of students from New York. And then I realized they self-select into the class because they're New Yorkers and they want to learn more about 9/11. They don't teach it in their high schools. And so it's been good to be able to do that with at least a small group of students here.
And what do they teach you about what happened?
It's all about, you know, of course I didn't know much when they were 1, but as they grew older,
Right.
listening to the stories of their parents and their relatives, and everyone knows where they were on 9/11. It's just kind of like how we started this show today. Everyone knows. It's just one of those defining moments. Everyone knows where they were when Kennedy was shot, if you were, you know, old enough to remember that. I remember everyone knows where they were when the Challenger exploded, and then this is like the 3rd major event. Everyone knows where they were on 9/11 and what was happening that day.
Is this kind of unendable war sustainable? I know we were talking a second ago about the troops and keeping them ready for war, but in general, $42 billion a year.
I think the issue is it sustainable politically in the United States?
Okay.
Because the troops can sustain it, but can the American people sustain the will to maintain forces in these places? You know, during the Cold War, we were in Germany for 40 years or so, and we were able to sustain a high commitment of treasure, not so much blood. And we were able to do that because we felt the stakes were worth it. And so the question is, do the American people feel the stakes are worth it to stay engaged? And if they don't, we'll get out, but then we have to own the consequences of getting out, just as we did in 2011 when we got out of Iraq and then had to go back in.
Okay, so what are the stakes? What would make it worth it?
Well, there hasn't been another major terrorist attack on U.S. soil. There have been, obviously, the lone wolf attacks and so forth, but there hasn't been another 9/11. And that's a major accomplishment. Now, if you think we need to be engaged over there to prevent that from happening or not is a different story. People say it's better just to put up our defenses and use good intelligence and so forth and not be involved overseas. But you know what? I think General Petraeus put it best when he was before an audience in New Albany here a year ago, and he said, Las Vegas rules do not apply in the Middle East. What happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. It tends to destabilize the rest of the world. And so I think whether we like it or not, we're going to be engaged one way or the other.
One of the ways that ISIS became what it became was the ability for them to recruit and touch the hearts and the souls of mostly men and increasingly women around the world. To come, not just there, but around the world, to come and give them money and to give them their lives in some cases. There's not a reverse psychology going on, it doesn't seem. It doesn't. I think we're into the military part of it and not the persuasion end of the game.
There's definitely battles being fought on the internet. We just don't hear about them.
Yeah.
And many of them are being fought by folks in the region, because we realize that Americans don't necessarily have the culture and linguistic background to fight those battles. So we often use our allies in the Middle East to do that. But you know, the best argument against being a ISIS recruit is ISIS is a loser, right? This was our major narrative in Iraq against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that they were a loser, that we had all focused on them, we had destroyed Al-Qaeda in Iraq, we had forced them out, and you don't hear about Al-Qaeda in Iraq anymore because they had to rebrand themselves, because Al-Qaeda in Iraq was equated with being a loser, and no one wants to join a loser. Well, ISIS for a brief moment in time was looking like a winner, and so you did have, you know, several thousand Europeans, a few dozen Americans flocked to the banner of Allah in Syria and join. But how many are going now, right? As soon as we put them on the ash heap of history and destroyed their infrastructure and destroyed their units and destroyed, no one wants to join a losing cause anymore, and so all of a sudden that flow has stopped. That is the best way to get to stop the exodus of young men and women to the Middle East, is to show these groups for what they are.
You know, 17 years ago, the internet wasn't what it is today. By far, the social media that we live with and we take for granted today almost didn't even exist back then. It was just chat rooms and weird places like that. How has that affected the military equation of this never-ending war?
Well, it's affected the military equation. It's affected the information battle, which is part of one element of power. You know, look, it's affected the United States in our own elections. We're in a sea change in terms of the involvement of publics in warfare and in politics, because they now have the means to do so, where before the internet, before social media, you couldn't harness that power as easily as you can today. Some of that is good, and some of that is really bad. But it's, you know, when historians look back on this era, they're going to point to the internet and social media as a sea change in the involvement of people in warfare.
Mm. You know, the Trump administration, getting back to Syria, they're talking about allying with Russia to fight the Iranian-led forces, and I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Iran and Russia are joined at the hip in terms of their objectives.
Right. So why are they even talking about? What's the end game there?
You know, I'd love to be a fly on the wall of the Oval Office. Of course, I'd record all the conversations too.
Well, with that said, who do you think is the op-ed writer for the New York Times?
Mr. Anonymous. We do know it's a male. They let that slip. Mm-hmm. So I have no idea.
But realistically, is that even the overtures that the Trump administration is making to players like Russia, like North Korea, how does that affect? You know,
well, President Trump looks at himself as a deal maker.
Yeah.
Right? And he thinks if he just gets a good relationship going with Kim Jong-un or Vladimir Putin, that he can cut a deal at some point. And you know, I think he's being played by both of them, but you know, we'll see. Maybe he is the great deal maker. We just haven't seen it yet. But he believes that he can somehow have a relationship with Putin where they can work things out in Syria. And I'm not sure how that's going to be possible if we also want to push back strongly against Iran in the Middle East, which is, you know, so he has on the one hand a goal of working closely with Russia. On the other hand, we know that he wants to push back hard against Iran. He's taken us out of the nuclear accord. Mm-hmm. He doesn't like Iranian meddling in various places in the Middle East, and he wants a strategy to push back against that. And unless you can somehow drive a wedge between Russia and Syria, it's going to be very difficult to do.
White House National Security Advisor John Bolton this week attacked the values of the International Criminal Court, saying that the Trump administration would sanction the court and ban its judges from the United States if it moves forward with a probe into alleged U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. How does the United States maintain a moral high ground given those kinds of moves?
You know, this is one where I'm with the Trump administration.
Okay.
The International Criminal Court was only supposed to look into war crimes committed by nations that didn't have systems, judicial systems that could look into them themselves. And for the International Criminal Court to look at United States operations in Afghanistan, I think is awful. And it's not what that court was designed to do. What it was designed to do was look into, like, the Balkans, where there's no judicial system that can handle the war crimes that were committed there. It should be looking into war crimes of ISIS and war crimes you know, in Gaza, but to look at the United States and our troops when we have an effective judicial system, we have an effective uniform code of military justice. You know, I shake my head. What are they doing? You know, is it for political advantage. I don't see it.
You don't.
Do they really don't think we investigate every single incident of friendly fire, every single incident of fire on civilians? We investigate all of that. What do they think we're not doing that they have to investigate?
But, okay, all right. So that said, then, if the judges are banned from the U.S., if they move forward with that probe, what does that do to that court?
Well, we're not a signatory to the ICC, so I don't think it necessarily does anything to it. Neither is China or Russia, by the way. Great powers don't want to cede any sort of their sovereignty to an international body in that regard that they have little control over. I think this is a good example why.
You're the military historian, obviously, and I'm just wondering, I know Syria, just like in Yemen, is a front, as you mentioned, of the Saudi-Iranian proxy war in that region. How long is that going to go on?
This is it's a horrible situation in Yemen. You have one of the largest cholera outbreaks in the history of mankind there. People are starving. Saudi Arabia actually made things worse rather than better by getting involved with their air power. I don't necessarily see an end to it, and it's really, we don't have a lot of agency in finishing that conflict because, we can't just tell Saudi Arabia, well, get out. They're a sovereign nation. They view Yemen as in their national security interest, and they're going to stay there. Now, if they were to withdraw, they would cede the place to the Houthis, who are now backed by Iran, and there you go. Saudi Arabia feels like it needs to be a bulwark against Iranian expansionism around the Middle East. I don't know that there's a good solution in Yemen, but this is one place where getting both sides to back off and allowing peace to prevail would be the best thing for both sides and for the people. What
do you think is the best route to that? What body out there is best equipped to make moves like that?
It's tough to say. It would be, you could see in a different circumstances some sort of talks between the United States, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the Yemenis. But given the bad blood in the diplomatic era these days, I don't see that happening.
You mentioned something early on in our conversation about the excellent diplomatic corps that the United States has. And some people might say that it's been, just terribly weakened over the last year and a half. It's just been decimated. Decimated would be too strong of a word, but...
Well, certainly morale is low, especially under the first year of the Trump administration. The diplomatic corps was marginalized. Its budget was decimated, and there were a lot of good diplomats leaving the service. The question is will this carry over between administrations? The Trump administration, even if it has 6 more years, will not be in power forever, presumably. And the question is, will the diplomatic corps, be able to regenerate at that point? I have great faith that it will. We are a strong nation. We'll have a strong diplomatic arm of government in due course.
I don't know. Is it time to open this up for questions? There's microphones on either side. I look forward to hearing from folks in the audience, yeah.
Just put a question mark after your statements.
Yeah.
I'll try to. Is this on?
It is.
Okay, good. Yeah, Pete, the students I teach at Ohio State, I would say a huge percentage of them have never known a time when the United States has not been at war in a pretty major way. I was wondering whether you can think of any conditions or preconditions where actually peace could break out and where the U.S. wouldn't be as involved in as many conflicts, particularly in the Middle East, as it is today.
I think peace is a very modern and very Western concept. Back in the Roman Empire, they had a temple dedicated to Janus, and they would close the doors when there was peace. And in the 600 years of the Roman Empire, 400 years or whatever, it was closed twice. And I think what we're seeing is, in this era, it is unlikely that the United States is going to be completely at peace, because even if we're not interested in war, as Vladimir Lenin would say, war is interested in us, or maybe it was Trotsky. And there will be terrorists that will come after us looking for weaknesses in our armor. They'll be going after our allies in the Middle East. Remember that Osama bin Laden's strategy was to attack the United States, get us involved in wars in the Middle East. That part of it worked spectacularly. But then it was to defeat us, force us out of the Middle East so that he could then attack the Arab governments and take over and recreate the caliphate. That strategy has not changed. And those organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda who would do that are still around. They're still going to be attacking. So the question is, how involved do we want to be to make sure that there's some sort of stability in that part of the world? I think most Americans would say not much if there's some other way to handle matters. But what we've seen is Arab Islamic states have destabilized since 9/11 and haven't grown stronger. And so for the foreseeable future, I'm not sure I can offer peace to the young men and women who have grown up with nothing but war.
Dr. Mansoor, this question is about the education of and future stability of our officer corps. As a Vietnam vet, I was an officer during Vietnam, I learned how well trained and educated our professional soldiers are. You know that yourself, sir. And after Vietnam, when General Powell and General Schwarzkopf were forced with decision-making about what was going to take place in the Mideast, we learned from press reports about how much they had learned about what they needed to do in the Mideast because of the mistakes in Vietnam. I'm wondering, sir, whether our officer corps in the future will be so well educated and as dedicated as your comrades, your age. Will we be able to keep our really good officers in the armed forces after the experiences they've had in Afghanistan?
In Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere in the war on terror, you know, I still keep in touch with a lot of my junior officers who are now senior officers. In fact, I have one of my company commanders who was a captain when I was a colonel, is now a colonel and just took over command of an infantry brigade in Fort Riley, Kansas. I have no doubt that we'll be able to retain the best. The officer corps is really good. It's a different question about whether we're educating them properly, though. I am fearful that we will return to believing that big wars are what we need to be good at, big wars are what we need to train for, and that we'll lose everything that we had learned over the course of these last 17 years about fighting counterinsurgency conflicts and about stabilization operations. Just as the Army after Vietnam wished it away and stopped studying counterinsurgency warfare because we would never fight those kind of wars again, at least so the thinking went, until we got into Iraq and we had to relearn everything at very high cost. And it took us 3 years to change our strategy and doctrine to actually fight the war properly. So when I have conversations with the various war college commandants around the United States, I always emphasize, yes, train for high-end combat, because that's obviously the most dangerous type of war the United States needs to fight. But don't forget about training or educating for these other types of conflicts as well, because the history of the United States shows that small wars are every bit as part of our history as the big wars, and there's a lot more of them And so the officer corps needs to be broadly educated in order to handle those kind of conflicts should they arise again.
Why are you concerned that they won't be properly educated?
Well, it goes to organizational culture. In fact, I just finished editing a volume on the culture of military organizations, and military organizations have an ethos of what they believe themselves to be. And in the United States Army, between the end of Vietnam and 2001, it believed it was the premier combat organization in the world for fighting high-end combat. Tanks, think tanks and howitzers and light infantry and whatnot. What it didn't study at all was counterinsurgency. It wasn't even an elective at the Command and General Staff College. And of course, when we got into that kind of war, we tried to, in Iraq, we tried to fight it as if it were a high-end military operation, and it just took way too long to adjust.
Was that partly an effect of Operation Desert Storm?
Partly as an outgrowth of Desert Storm was wonderfully successful. And
fast.
And fast, you know, is everything we want wars to be, but it blinded us to what conflicts could be, you know, because you don't always get to choose the kind of conflict you have to fight. Sometimes it finds you. And the initial 6 weeks of Operation Iraqi Freedom looked like a repeat of Desert Storm. Fast, you know, quick. We got to Baghdad, high-fiving each other, and we completely ignored the signs of the budding insurgency until it was pretty robust and very difficult to handle.
I suppose the irony is that Desert Storm was a precursor to Operation Iraqi Freedom because it was a dissatisfaction with the ultimate resolution of Desert Storm that inspired.
So we finished the war and took down Saddam, and look what we got. It shows the wisdom of, I think, of the people back in 1991 that they stopped in Kuwait.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, first of all, thank you, Peter, for all you've done for the country and for all of us in this war, and for sharing your expertise and being on our faculty, actually. Speaking of education, of course, you have a PhD, and so I think that speaks well of our officer corps. You've described very nicely tonight, I think, and through your career, what we can do and have done with force on the war on terror and the efforts in Iran and Iraq and so on. Sorry, Iraq and Afghanistan. But the real question, it seems to me, you've brought up, and yet I never hear it discussed, which is, what's it going to take to achieve stability within the Middle East itself? And you only can go so far with force, and we're now in a region which has been, as you said, destabilized, but it has no history of democracy or anything beyond various kinds of autocratic governments. And it seems to me that that is going to have to get sorted out somehow for this problem really to be more or less solved in the long run. So I'm curious what your thoughts in that direction are.
Well, I think your question got to the heart of the problem, and there's very little agency that the United States has in this regard. The Arab world, the Arab Islamic world is coming apart. It's unraveling. The governments don't necessarily have a lot of legitimacy, and when governments stay in power by force, they're inherently unstable. The ones that seem to be stable, such as Iran, are also using their power to destabilize others. So I don't see a solution for this. This is something that is going to be worked out over a generation or two, or decades in the future. It's not like you can snap your finger. We thought that the Arab Spring would bring forth representative governments that could be stable because the people have a voice in their creation. That was not the case. The only place that's worked out even halfway decently is Tunisia, and it's got a lot of problems. So I don't know what the United States can do. We have the economic lever of power. We can help people diplomatically. We can try to play peacemaker in some of these conflicts. But the conflicts are going to play out. The conflict in Syria is going to play out. The conflict in Libya is going to play out, in Yemen. And there's only a limited amount of agency that the United States has in solving anything over there.
Did we increase or decrease our agency when the United States got out of the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, it's an interesting question. The argument against it was, well, then Iran will develop nuclear weapons. Well, that hasn't necessarily been the case. It's too early to tell, but they still have other people that are in that deal, primarily European nations, and they don't want to necessarily cross them. So we may actually get the best of both worlds with Iran abiding by the letter of the deal, and yet we now have freedom of action to push back against bad Iranian behavior around the Middle East. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
I'm here representing architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. On September 11th at 5:20 in the afternoon, World Trade Center 7 collapsed into its own footprint in what is obviously a controlled demolition. A controlled demolition implies that there was planning. Planning implies foreknowledge. Foreknowledge means that the entire narrative, official narrative of 9/11 is wrong, and that the entire never-ending war on terror is based on a series of lies which has continued to haunt this country and the world since the day it happened.
And your question?
My question is, how does your contention that this is a legitimate war stand up to the scrutiny which is now about to become widely known? As we speak, there is a conference going on in New York City sponsored by the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. A grand jury has now been issued a document which is calling for a new investigation into the events of 9/11. World Trade Center 7 could not have fallen in the manner that is described by NIST. It's been demonstratively proved that it's false. That means the entire war on terror is based on a lie. And the implications of that are so profound that it's hard for me to imagine that at this point this topic hasn't been discussed more broadly across the entire spectrum of media. It's the most important event that has ever happened in our lives, and the majority of people in this country don't even know that it happened.
There's a reason it hasn't been discussed in the media, because what you've just put forth is a crackpot conspiracy theory that has no basis in
This is
truth.
exactly the response I would
Thank you
expect
for your,
from you.
Thank you for your statement.
And this is exactly the reason why public radio no longer has any validity for me.
I will say, for those so inclined, one of the better government documents of, is this still on?
Yeah.
One of the better government documents that I've seen published was the 9/11 Commission report. It was a bipartisan group that examined the 9/11 in all its aspects. And I commend it to your reading. It's part of my syllabus for this my course on the wars of 9/11, and my students read it. It's I think an example of government investigation at its best. And so for those who actually want to look into those sorts of conspiracy theories, I commend it to your reading. Steve.
I think my question is a variation of unintended consequences of initial conditions. And I was just thinking of it in connection with this, that 19 men armed with box cutters carry out an act which leads to this massive, intractable, seemingly endless war. And the richest country, the most powerful country in the world, sends tanks and planes across oceans, spends at least $6-7 trillion over 17 years, turns itself inside out politically, economically, in all kinds of ways. Is it, in your broader thinking, can you envision that maybe we need a completely different conception of what our role in the world is, what the role of making war is to address this?
Well, exactly. So this, I think, is one thing that the Trump administration, this administration, has brought into the public consciousness, that the United States as a global policeman, as a world hegemon, as a unipolar power, those days are over and actually should never have come to pass. That our decision making in the wake of 9/11 was wrong, not necessarily going into Afghanistan, I think we had to do that, but going into Iraq for sure, and that this belief that U.S. power was so great that we could reshape the world in our image, we need to, put that away in the drawer and not pull it out again. That the world has got a lot of agency without America deciding what's going to happen in it. And, we need to look inward to our own republic and our own economy and our own people and, and do good by them. And I don't think that's necessarily a Republican or a Democratic view. I think it's a view of a lot of Americans these days who look back on 17 years of war and wonder what they got for it.
Do you see evidence of this change? I mean, do you see evidence of this change? There are weapon systems like tanks that are manufactured parts in 40 different states that were so locked into this whole military-industrial complex and making war and policing the world. In spite of what I agree with what you say, have we made any movement in that direction towards elimination?
Not really. If you look at the foreign policy of the Trump administration, it's a very realist foreign policy, but it still has the United States engaged as a power broker vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Iran. And so I don't see this administration necessarily pulling back. I thought during the campaign maybe that Trump was a neo-isolationist, and I don't think so necessarily. He's just a deal maker. But the way his foreign policy is panned out, he doesn't like alliances necessarily, but he's not necessarily pulling the United States back from its role in the world. He's just reshaping it, if you will. In fact, he's increasing the defense budget.
Well, I was going to bring up the military-industrial complex issue by way of the quote that you made, whether it's Trotsky or Lenin, that war is interested in us. And is there, are the marketers of war, is the commercialization of the things of war interested in us?
Well, obviously there is a defense industry that has a strong lobbying organization. There's military leaders that are interested in their services and so forth, but it really goes to U.S. goals and strategy. If our goal is to maintain our NATO alliance, push back against Russian movements into Ukraine and Crimea, to counterbalance China's movement into the South China Sea, the creation of militarized islands, that all takes power. You cannot just do that by going before the United Nations and decrying what they're up to. You have to have ships and tanks and planes to be able, and organizations that can stand up to that and that our allies can rely on. So, until and unless the United States changes its goals in the world and changes its strategy, I don't see necessarily its military infrastructure declining in terms of budget share or the amount of resources we put into it.
Sir.
Good evening. My daughter was one of the 16 fortunate to be in your 9/11 seminar 2 years ago, and as a result, I read Surge, your textbook. It struck me that in the book you were fairly optimistic that Iraq could be a stabilizing force and potentially a democratic force in the Middle East. Now that we're a little further forward, what's your assessment of Iraq, and are you still optimistic?
I'm reminded of the question that someone put to Chou En-lai in the 1970s about what he thought about the French Revolution, and he said, too early to tell. I write in Surge that the tides of history wash in strange directions, and Iraq may yet work out, even though it doesn't look, so great at the moment. It didn't look great when I wrote that either. But look at the bright side. It does have elections. Now it's fighting like cats and dogs over the formation of this government, but it hasn't yet come to devolved into civil war the way other Arab states has. Somehow this democracy that is representative form of government is kind of plodding along, and we'll see. If they can continue to form governments and have elections, it may become an example of a state that is stabilized because it has a government that's more representative of its people's interests. And I do think it's too early to tell. I mean, it may all fall apart tomorrow, too. I am hopeful that Haider al-Abadi can survive. He seems like a pretty good and moderate leader, but we'll see.
Thank you for being here today. After the crackpot comment, I had to come forward. I was very fortunate to be able to be in a class that was an elective for the John Glenn College master's program, and it was studying strong and weak states, and I'm sure you're familiar with that class. I had a comment and then a question. One of the important things we studied in that particular class was, what is the criteria for whether or not the United States should be exporting democracy? And we studied that really at length in lots of different ways. And I relearned my age 15 civics, things that I'd long since forgotten. But it was very interesting. And regarding the things that you've stated today, one of the things that came forth in that class was that, it's a very different situation in today's world from the exporting of democracy, let's say, that occurred in the Pacific theater and in the European theater after World War II. And my dad was 4th Marine Division on EWO, and we have a young man in our family now who's a JAG in the Army and deploying for the second time to go to Afghanistan to help them form their rules of law. And so all this kind of came circle in this particular program. And so obviously it worked in Germany and in Japan. And they were happy to have us, happy to have our strength and our background. And I feel that there was some humility in the United States process for doing that. So we shouldn't forget that, because there was a lot of sacrifice made for that to happen. Now, my question to you is, when you have the young JAGs going out today and they're going into Afghanistan and they're trying to help them find the solution that we're talking about here, what do you feel is the most important work for them to do? Their challenge, or what we're hearing a big challenge is, it's so tribal oriented. How do you infuse democracy into that situation? Do you think they're asking for help? And should we help them by exporting and everything that goes with that? And what do you see as maybe like the top 2 processes that need to occur when these JAGs go over there, when the military individuals go over there to help them form what we hope will be a new life for these people?
Right. So we went through this in Iraq as well, and there's only so much we can do to implant democracy in places that have no experience of it. On the other hand, what other form of government would people suggest? I know that some people said, well, we should just find another dictator and put that person in charge. That would not have worked out so well.
He did keep the peace for a few years, but be that as it may.
But what we really wanted our JAGs to do, and we had a great one in Iraq, Mark Martins, and by the way, we had Senator Lindsey Graham, who would come over as Colonel Lindsey Graham. He'd come over as senator with John McCain. He'd look at what was happening. We'd take him on tours of the markets and whatnot, and he'd get briefings, and then he'd stay. Lindsey Graham would stay for his 2 weeks of training, because he was a reserve JAG officer, and he'd be Colonel Graham working for Mark Martins in our JAG office. And what they were trying to do is get the court system to function without corruption, and to implant the rule of law in places that really haven't known it. That is probably the number one thing that our JAG officers can do when they go over to these countries. And it is the Lord's work. I mean, it is very, very difficult. Afghanistan is one of the most corrupt places on earth. In Iraq, The prime minister would interfere with the justice system, and as a result, people we knew were guilty of murder would get off scot-free because of their ethnicity or their sect, because they were Shiite. And it was really, really difficult. But they made baby steps along the way, and they were able to advance the rule of law somewhat. And that's maybe as much as we can expect in some of these places.
A huge, once the Taliban took over Afghanistan, everything changed, and education was the first thing to go. I mean, Afghanistan, in its day, was relatively cosmopolitan, and
at least in Kabul.
Right. Well, now it's nowhere. How do you do things as nuanced as the rule of law when there's such a poorly educated populace now? It's ridiculous.
Although the education's
they're working on it,
getting better in Afghanistan. But I went over there in December 2010 at the invitation of General Patriot. I was Dr. Mansoor. I was retired at the time, and I came away from that very short experience thinking, if we really worked hard at it for 20 years, we could propel Afghanistan headlong from the 13th into the 14th century.
Now
it's tough. I mean, we shouldn't be there to state build. I think it's a fool's errand. I mean, we can help them, but they really want it. You can't coach desire, right? They got to want it. And I think a lot of Afghans do want it, but there's a significant number, mainly the Pashtun people, who do not. And this is going to be something eventually they'll have to work out on their own. It would be lovely to just leave and let them do that, but I don't see that in the cards.
Any more? Okay, one more question.
Just real quick. Part of the photographic memory, 9/11, Hiroshima, Pearl Harbor, all the other issues that you want to point out in history, we forget history before. Afghanistan was not new to the United States. We were in the United States, was in Afghanistan since the 70s. How do we arise larger in a post-9/11 world to understand how we got there? Because 9/11 was not an attack on the U.S. It was an attack on arrogance in the economy and the world and the war mechanisms.
I'm not sure I understand the premise of the question, but
yeah, that's probably part of the problem, is because my whole essence is an objection to your worldview. It's that war is inevitable. If we're going to live in a world of war, what is the next step for your generation?
Again, I'm not following you. The United States cannot disengage from the world. And although we would love to engage peacefully, there are a number of places around the world where only the use of force can gain our national security objectives. I'm not sure where you're heading.
Okay. Well, part of the discussion today, 10 to 12, 15% was never for this war in the United States. You sounded at the very beginning that it was unanimous. It was never unanimous. There was always a portion of the population that was against it, always. You even had folks on all sides talking about it. So when we're in a state of war where mercenaries are larger than the U.S. personnel, and you're saying ICC or other criminal courts can't handle those, especially when our courts are very truly not able to deal with mercenaries. They've let go mercenaries just this week. John Bolton, outlandishly talking about the U.S. sanctioning the ICC. So you can't say you can't have it both ways. So my point, moving towards the future, transitioning towards Asia, let's just take it out of Afghanistan. What is our agenda?
Okay.
It's for the American people and their political leaders to determine. Again, I've got a certain view of the world. It's probably a topic for a different conversation than the one we're having now, that views the United States as indispensable to the kind of world order that I think would advance the principles of peace and justice. And I view that in my view, there's a role for the military element of power in that kind of world. To wish it away, I think, would be to look at the world not as it is, but as you want it to be. And if you go back and you study the great historians, beginning with Thucydides, you see that human nature is not going to change. There are going to be people who use force to achieve their ends, and that is not going to change. And we can either accept the world for what it is, or we can retreat into our shell and then let the world do to us what it will. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but...
Dr. Peter Mansoor, thank you so much for the conversation tonight. I appreciate it.
Excellent.
And thanks to all of you as well for joining us. We appreciate your attention and your questions and your interest. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
How about one more round of applause for Peter and Ann?
I think someone wanted a photo.
And for you all, this was exactly what we want to do. We want to have a dialogue. We want to have a civil dialogue. Even though we don't agree on every point, a civil dialogue brings these things out. My rule to our reporters at WOSU is tell me something I don't know. And I think we learned a lot of stuff that we didn't know when we walked in here this evening. So success. We have another one coming up. Tuesday, October 2nd, Kai Ryssdal, the host of Marketplace, the business show on WOSU 89.7 NPR News, will be here. And we're going to talk about the future of work and how we're all going to find jobs when everything is robotic. So from one war to the other, Tuesday, October 2nd, right here at Fawcett. So watch your emails or watch the websites at the Glenn College and at WOSU.org. So for the Glenn College and WOSU, thank you all for coming.